Welcome back, AP. It's chapter 24, Industry Comes of Age. We're looking at the time period of 1865 to 1900. We are again continuing with time period 6, and this chapter focuses on key concept 6.1. The rise of big business in the United States encouraged massive migrations and urbanization, sparked government and popular efforts to reshape the United States economy and environment, and renewed debates over the United States' national identity. A lot of terms to know for this chapter and people to know. The iron colt becomes the iron horse. Due to the expansion of the country, many new railroads were built. Congress began to advance liberal money loans to two favored cross-continent companies in 1862 in response to the fact that the transcontinental railroad construction was so costly and risky. Growing railroads took up more land than they were allotted because their land grants were given over a broad path through the proposed route. The railroad owners would then choose the route to build on. President Grover Cleveland ended the land dispute in 1887 when he opened up all the unclaimed public portions of the grants to the public. Spanning the continent with the rails. The Union Pacific Railroad was commissioned by Congress in 1862 to build a transcontinental railroad starting in Omaha, Nebraska. Many railroad workers, including Irish, were forced to pick up their rifles and fight when Indians attempted to defend their lands. Rail lying at the California end of the railroad was taken up by the Central Pacific Railroad. The four chief financial backers of the enterprise were the Big Four, which included Leland Stanford and Collins P. Huntington. They operated through two construction companies. The Union Pacific Railroad and the Central Pacific Railroad companies both received monetary aid from the government. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, increasing trade with Asia and opening up the West for expansion. Binding the continent with railroad ties. There were a total of 5 transcontinental railroads built. The Northern Pacific Railroad, running from Lake Superior to the Puget Sound, was completed in 1883. The Atchison Railroad from Topeka to California was completed in 1884, and the Southern Pacific, stretching from New Orleans to San Francisco, was completed in 1884. And then finally, the Great Northern, which was running from Duluth to Seattle, was completed in 1893 by James J. Hill. Railroad consolidation and mechanization. The railroad was Cornelius Vanderbilt's enterprise. There was 2 significant improvements that benefited the railroad: the steel rails and the standard gauge of track width. Steel rails were much stronger and safer than the traditional iron rails. Revolution on the railways. The railroad stimulated the industrialization of the country in the post-Civil War years. It created an enormous domestic market for the American raw materials and manufactured goods. Railroad companies also stimulated immigration. At this time, every town in the United States had its own local time. In order to keep schedules and avoid wrecks, the major rail lines stated on November 18, 1883, that the continent would be divided into 4 time zones. Most towns accepted the new method. Wrongdoing in railroading. With great wealth and prosperity came much corruption. In order to increase the weight of cows, stock watering was employed. It entailed forcing a cow to bloat itself with water before it was weighed for sale. This technique enabled railroad stock promoters to inflate their claims about a given line's assets and profitability, and sell stocks and bonds in excess of the railroad's actual value. Railroaders, feeling that they were above the law, abused the public by bribing judges and legislatures. Railroad kings were manipulators of a huge natural monopoly and exercised too much direct control over the lives of people. Many rail barons granted rebates or kickbacks or bribes to powerful shippers in return for steady traffic. Railroad companies combined with other companies in order to protect their profits. Pools, or agreements to divide the business in a given area, and share the profits were the earliest form of combinations. Government bridles the iron horse. With the onset of the Depression of the 1870s came protests from farmers against railroaders who ran the farmers into bankruptcy. Many Midwestern legislatures tried to regulate the railroad monopoly, but in 1886 the Supreme Court ruled in the Wabash case that the individual states had no power to regulate interstate commerce. In 1887, Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act. It prohibited rebates and pools, required the railroads to publish their rates openly, forbade unfair discrimination against shippers, and outlawed charging more for a short trip than for a long one over the same line. It also created the Interstate Commerce Commission to administer and enforce the new legislation. The new laws provided an orderly forum where competing business interests would resolve their conflicts in peaceful ways. The laws tended to stabilize the existing railroad business. Miracles of mechanization. The telephone was created in 1876 by Alexander Graham Bell. This invention revolutionized the way the Americans communicated. Thomas Alva Edison invented numerous devices, with the most well-known being his perfection of the incandescent light bulb in 1879. The trust titan emerges. Tycoons like Andrew Carnegie, the Steel King, John D. Rockefeller, the oil baron, and J. Piermont Morgan, or J.P. Morgan, the banker's banker, circumvented their competition. Carnegie used tactics of vertical integration to combine all phases of manufacturing into one organization. He and his business controlled every aspect of production from mining to marketing. His goal was to improve efficiency. Another way that these titans emerged was through horizontal integration, which entailed allying with competitors to monopolize a given market. And this tactic was one that created trust and was often employed by John D. Rockefeller. And this slide shows vertical versus horizontal integration. If you employ vertical, like Andrew Carnegie, you're buying up all parts that are related to a specific business. And if you're employing horizontal, it's basically controlling all of a given industry, and in this case, Rockefeller and his Standard Oil Company. Some of the captains of industry. So looking first at Andrew Carnegie and his steel production. Steel was king during the industrial era. Nearly every aspect of society used it. The United States soon outdistanced all foreign competitors and was producing a third of the world's steel supply. The Bessemer process allowed for the price of steel to drop dramatically and its production to be done with relative ease. The process involved blowing cold air on red-hot iron in order to ignite the carbon and eliminate impurities. Andrew Carnegie was not a monopolist and actually disliked monopolist trusts. He entered the steel business in the Pittsburgh area and created an organization with about 40 Pittsburgh millionaires. By 1900, he was producing a quarter of the nation's Bessemer steel. John D. Rockefeller. Kerosene was the first major product of the oil industry, but the invention of the light bulb rendered kerosene obsolete. By 1900, the gasoline-burning internal combustion engine had beaten out its rivals as the primary means of automobile propulsion. The birth of the automobile gave a great lift to the oil industry. John D. Rockefeller organized the Standard Oil Company of Ohio in 1870, attempting to eliminate the middlemen and knock out his competitors. By 1877, he controlled 95% of the oil refineries in the nation. Rockefeller grew to such a great power by eliminating his competitors. Other trusts grew in addition to the oil. These included the Sugar Trust, the Tobacco Trust, the Leather Trust, and the Harvester Trust. J.P. Morgan financed the reorganization of railroads, insurance companies, and banks. In 1900, Carnegie was eager to sell his holdings of his company. At that time, Morgan was starting to manufacture steel pipe tubing. Carnegie threatened to ruin his rival Morgan by invading the same business if Morgan did not buy him out. Finally, Morgan agreed to buy out Carnegie for $400 million. Morgan expanded his industrial empire and created the United States Steel Corporation in 1901. It was America's first billion-dollar corporation. Carnegie then dedicated the rest of his life to donating the rest of his money to charities. Sears and Roebuck. Many new products in the later 1800s needed markets, and how were retailers going to be able to reach those in the Midwest or in small farms? In 1890s, two Chicago entrepreneurs, Richard Sears and Alva Roebuck, began offering goods by mail. They purchased goods in high volume from wholesalers and then sold it at prices that were lower than the local rural stores. The development of free rural mail delivery in 1898 meant that rural Americans could purchase goods before were expensive or only available to those who lived in the city. The new business helped create a truly national market. The Gospel of Wealth. The wealthy proclaimed that they were justified by God to have so much wealth. They claimed that God gave them their money or that they were a product of natural selection. Plutocracy, government controlled by the wealthy, took control of the Constitution. The clause that gave Congress sole jurisdiction over the interstate commerce was a bonus for the monopolists. They used their lawyers to thwart controls by state legislatures. Large trusts also sought safety behind the 14th Amendment, arguing that corporations were actually legal people. Government tackles the evil trust. Hailing to the public demand, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. This act forbade combinations and restraint of trade without any distinction between good trusts and bad trusts. The law proved ineffective because it contained legal loopholes and made all large trusts safer, not just the bad ones. When looking at these industrialists, there are two ways that they can be described. Some viewed them as robber barons, which would be a negative term, and others as captains of industry. You can look through some of the highlighted areas and decide for yourself. The South in the Age of Industry. Throughout the industrial strife in the North, the South produced a smaller percentage of the nation's manufactured goods. Southern agriculture received a boost in the 1880s when the machine-made cigarettes replaced earlier methods of producing cigarettes. This caused tobacco consumption to shoot up. James Buchanan Duke took advantage of the growing tobacco business and formed the American Tobacco Company in 1890. Numerous obstacles lay in the path of Southern industrialization. The Northern-dominated railroad companies charged lower rates on manufactured goods moving southward from the North, but higher rates when raw materials were shipped from the South to the North. The Pittsburgh Plus pricing system was an economic discrimination against the South and the steel industry. Rich deposits of coal and iron ore were discovered in Birmingham, Alabama. The steel lords of Pittsburgh brought pressure to bear on compliant railroads. As a result, Birmingham steel was charged a fictional fee no matter where it was shipped. The South strived in manufacturing cotton textiles. By 1880, Northern capital had created cotton mills in the South. Those who worked the cotton mills were in perpetual debt and were paid extremely low wages. The impact of Industrial Revolution on America. During the decades after the Civil War, economic miracles increased the standard of living in the United States. The industry of agriculture declined to manufacturing. Women were most affected by the new industrial age. Women found jobs as inventions arose. The typewriter and the telephone switchboard gave women new economic and social opportunities. The nation of farmers and independent producers was becoming a nation of wage earners. By the beginning of the 1900s, the vast majority of the nation's population earned wages. Now we're going to look at the labor movement. In unions there is strength. Due to the rise in wage earners in factories, the owners of factories did not have any relationship with their employees. New machines displaced employees, but in the long run, more jobs were created than destroyed. Factory workers eventually began to go on strike, complaining of their wages. Corporations sometimes compelled their workers to sign ironclad oaths or yellow dog contracts, saying the workers would not join a labor union. Some corporations even owned the company town, increasing the prices of basic living so that the company could gain wealth. The middle-class public grew tired of constant strikes, knowing that American wages were of the highest in the world. Labor limps along. The Civil War, which put a premium on human labor, gave a boost to labor unions. The National Labor Union, organized in 1866, lasted 6 years and attracted 600,000 members. Black workers also formed their own Colored National Labor Union. The Colored National Labor Union's support for the Republican Party and racism of white unionists prevented it and the National Labor Union from working together. After the National Labor Union pretty much died out in 1877, the Knights of Labor took over. Led by Terence V. Powderly, the Noble and High Order of the Knights of Labor was formed in 1869 as a secret society and remained secret until 1881. It sought to include all workers in one big union and campaigned for economic and social reform, including codes for safety and health. The Knights of Labor. On May 4th, 1886, in Haymarket Square, Chicago, police advanced on a meeting called to protest alleged brutalities by authorities. A dynamite bomb was thrown and killed dozens of people. 8 anarchists were tried and convicted. 5 were sentenced to death, while the other 3 were sent to jail. In 1892, the governor of Illinois pardoned the 3 who were in prison. The Knights of Labor were blamed for the incident at Haymarket Square, and as a result, it lost public support. Another downfall for the Knights of Labor was that it included both skilled and unskilled workers. When unskilled workers went on strike, they were just replaced. The American Federation of Labor's inclusion of the only skilled workers worked to drain the Knights of Labor of its participants. The American Federation of Labor was founded in 1886 and was led by Samuel Gompers. The Federation consisted of an association of self-governing national unions, each of which kept its own independence. It sought for better wages, hours, and working conditions. The Federation's main weapons were the walkout and the boycott. The greatest weakness of organized labor was that it still embraced only a small minority of all working people. Labor Day was created by Congress in 1894. This map shows an area of counties reporting strikes between the year 1870 and 1900, and you can see where the major strikes were located. Some cause and effects of the major strikes from the labor unions.